All right, so today we have here Carson Gross. He is the creator of HTMX. That's probably what you're best known for right now, but you actually have quite a bit more to you than I think a lot of people realize. First off, you have quite the pedigree of schools. Do you know this man
Mm,
graduated with a Bachelor of Science from Berkeley? Okay, that's already better than me. I mean, I can't even imagine how many drum circles you were a part of. And then you got a
mm,
master's at Stanford. I mean,
yeah.
you just toured the Bay Area. Did you grow up in the Bay?
Well, I grew up sort of outside the Bay. I was born in San Francisco, believe it or not, and then but my parents moved up to Sacramento, which is kind of northeast of the
Yep.
Bay Area, and so I grew up outside of Sacramento, kind of on the east side, up by Folsom Lake. So I didn't. I'm definitely not a Bay Area person. That's like its own culture, and even the Bay Area is. I mean, it's a big. There's a lot of different subcultures there. Um, but so I grew up outside Sacramento, and then I spent a long time in the Bay Area. I went to Berkeley for undergrad. I actually dropped out of computer science. I
Really?
Yeah, I was used to being, one of the smarter kids in my school, and then I went to Berkeley and CS. Like I remember sitting down at a Unix workstation and being like, okay, like where's the pointer? Like I had been working on Macs, doing like hypercard stuff, thought I was super smart and all that. And there was no, like, there was just like an X on a blank screen. Like, what do I click on? This mouse had three buttons on it. I freaked out. So I tried to, be a computer scientist for a couple of years. And then somewhat ironically, I now teach the class that knocked me out of computer science at Berkeley. So the systems class is what just did it for me.
Yeah.
Like, screw it. And so I ended up switching to industrial engineering. But then I wanted to be in the Bay Area, and there's no industrial engineering, or there's not
None.
much industrial engineering in the Bay
Yeah.
Area. And so I knew how to program, and so I just kept programming. And then after a couple of years, I kind of regretted dropping out of CS, and so I said, "Well, I'll try and get my master's." And my wife was going to med school down at Stanford, and so I guess did her internship there, and so that was kind of the option.
You just casually drop your wife's a doctor. Oh, by the way, she's a doctor of something, something.
she,
Stanford. Not a big
yeah,
deal. You wouldn't understand.
she's way smarter than I am for sure. My poor beset upon wife, holy smokes.
That's pretty funny. All right. And so currently you are at Montana State University, which is,
Yeah,
it's hard to juxtapose that with your Bay Area time because you said you wanted to remain in the Bay Area. And now you live in Bozeman, Montana, which I guess when you arrived, which is four years ago, it looks like
yeah,
that at that point, Bozeman was just little Bay Area.
yeah.
Why Montana?
Well, so I had a startup in Sacramento called Lead Dino. It's still an ongoing concern, but that I had worked on with a couple other guys and built it into a really good lifestyle business. It was never going to be like a super, home run type business.
Yeah.
But I didn't really want a home run business. I had been part of a startup called Guidewire, and which was like sort of the classic Bay Area, raise a bunch of money and then go public type thing. And I'd seen how that went down, and I just wasn't super interested in like kind of that culture of like, I don't want to say pump and dump, but like you're trying to go public, and like,
Yeah.
there's a big focus on the sort of quarter to quarter financials. It always appealed to me much more to have like a business that I owned and that just generated money, and that was it. And so we'd built this pretty good startup, but unfortunately my co-founders, who I got along with reasonably well. I mean, you always have conflicts. Like I'm a pretty strong personality. Certainly I was even more strong 10 years ago than I am now. And but unfortunately, those two co-founders couldn't get along, and so they were just fighting with each other constantly. And we had some issues, like some technical and non-technical issues, come up. They eventually were like, I can't be around this other person, and so we ended up having to sort of sell the company. And I was, yeah, I was in, I don't want to say I was in a bad spot, but I was in a pretty bad spot after that, because I kind of had this life plan, like I'm going to
Yeah.
build this like lifestyle business. It's going to let me work, like 4 or 5 hours a day. And then I'm going to coach my kids in baseball and make sure I'm around for them growing up. And then that got kind of blown up. And we've been coming out here to Bozeman for summers and ski. My family skis and so forth. And I just was like on a lark. I saw a job posting for Montana State for an instructor position and was like, why not? And so I applied for it kind of as a joke, and then didn't hear anything for like 6 months. And then like right when like everything was sort of like coming to a head, I got an email back from them, and they were like, "Hey, you want to come out and interview?" And I was like, sort of looked at my wife and was like, could you do Montana? And she's a California girl. I'm a California guy. She's even more of a California girl. But she said, well, we can try it. And so we came out here and been out here for almost 5 years now.
Nice. Okay. So you at Montana State, you teach 4 classes. At least that's what you say you teach, which is 440 DBs or databases, 468 compilers, 366 system programming, so C and assembly, and then ESOF 322 software engineering. And so you've been around in this industry, I assume, for some amount of time. You're slightly older than I am. And so you've seen some trends change. And so when I was up at Montana State University, I was actually getting my master's at one point in software engineering. I didn't know you could get that it turns out that's an actual degree, software engineering. And part of that was just making UML diagrams and sequence diagrams nonstop. So this was like circa 2010, 2011, right in there. How has that changed? Like, what is software engineering today taught in schools, and does it like actually make someone prepared for the real world?
Boy, you're going to get me in trouble. I hope the department doesn't see this. When I teach software engineering, I actually don't focus on UML very much. It's very much the academic perspective on software engineering. When I teach ESOF, and I'm hoping to teach again this year, I mostly assign papers. Like, have you ever read the Worse is Better paper?
Yes. Yeah.
So like I assign papers like that. And
I reacted to it. In fact, I'm pretty sure it's on my YouTube channel.
Yeah. So I'm more, I assign like what I consider classic papers from computer science that tend to be more philosophical rather than like technical. Like Worse is Better. And then there's a philosophy of software design by Osterhout, who's a professor at Stanford. He's the guy who created Tickle, the Tickle programming language. That would be a fun riff if you've never messed around with Tickle. So the way I teach ESOF is different, and I do a lot of like small programming problems. Like, here's an ugly function, let's refactor it. Like very small things, not big conceptual things as far as the code goes. And I do because I'm required to do it, I do about a week of UML. But like, just as an example, the way my compiler class works is that you write a compiler. Like you basically write your own lexer by hand, no tools, and then you write a recursive descent parser. And one of the requirements for graduation is that you produce a UML diagram for your project and this is like a capstone project. And so the problem with the project that I give the students is it's already like the data infrastructure is already there, but what you have to do is you have to sort of like write the recursive descent and so forth. And so it ends up just being a bad software program for writing UML. And so I just have them do what's called a process diagram instead, which sort of documents the way recursive descent works. So I don't know. I'm not huge on patterns, but that's the way that it is.
Okay.
Still there?
Yeah. Okay. That's sorry, I haven't moved. I'm very much so watching you. Okay, so that's a very, I guess, interesting kind of take because during, especially like when you started your startup, I believe you started in 2006. During that time, that was like the beginning of like peak abstract builder factory beans, right? Like everything was as just like software engineered, wear a suit and everything as possible. And so now you're teaching software engineering as an actual college level course, and that has effectively largely transitioned out. Do you have an idea what the next big transition is for kind of software engineering as an academic pursuit?
As an academic pursuit, I'd like to see like more sort of field analysis. We've got GitHub now, so we can look at a lot of code bases. And I think more empirical research around, like, for example, one of the things I'm sorry to admit, I didn't watch the Uncle Bob interview. But if my very high level understanding of Uncle Bob's philosophy of software is correct, he's in favor of lots of small decomposed methods. Is that correct?
That's a fairly good statement. I believe he says that whenever he sees a function beyond 4 to 6 lines of code, it's like a point to remember to potentially refactor to make it smaller.
Right.
Not
And
a
I think
hard and
I've
fast
said,
rule, a
right.
spiritual rule, if you will.
Sure. And I don't agree with that. Like, I think large functions are fine. Like, if you've got a lot of it, like, one thing I've said before is when I come into a code base, if I can, like, I'd rather see like 10 files than 1,000 files, like a bunch of decomposed little things. And I'd rather see, obviously it depends, but like in one particular file, if there's one thing that it does, I'd prefer to see that as like one function. And if that function's large, if it's 50 or even 100 lines of code, I'm okay with that. And I don't think there's an aesthetic argument against that. I think there's an aesthetic argument for it. Like, important things should be big. That's an aesthetic argument. There's no, right or wrong there. But I'd like to see empirical studies. There was an IBM study on like ideal function length to like bugs, the ideal function length to bug ratio, and they had said that function lengths up to 100 lines of code, I think even more, were actually better than like lots of small functions. So that's the kind of thing that like I've got my preference, but I can't point to it. Like, I have to dig up that old IBM paper, and it's probably in COBOL or something like that, so it's not necessarily relevant today. But I'd like to see more of that from the software engineering world. Like, hey, like, instead of like what we get, and I was actually talking about this on Twitter just recently. You get a lot of Platonism in software engineering. Like,
can you explain that term?
Platonism is like idealism. So a classic example when someone's first encounters HTMX is they say, oh, you're doing all this work on the server now. That's going to cost more because you're doing CPU work, you're doing CPU work on the server. And it's like, well, okay, there's something to that for sure. But that's just an idealized world. Like, what about let's look at the real world. Like, if generating HTML on the server is a round off error compared to like data store access, which it typically is, then the fact that you're doing more CPU, you may be burning a little bit more CPU on the server, it really doesn't matter. It's not going to cost you anymore. It's not going to hurt user performance. There's other stuff to think about, and that other stuff should be derived from looking at real world situations rather than sort of these ideal, like, we're computer scientists, so we tend to be very like, we work with ideas. That's how we make our living. And so we tend to be very idealistic in that regard. And I think that what I would love to see from software engineering is, I've been, again, saying this on Twitter, like more of an Aristotelian, like look at the actual, like, how are SPAs actually built in the real world? Like, what are the issues with them? How is hypermedia used in the real world? What are the issues with it? And rather than just trying to argue from first principles all the time.
Yeah, that makes sense. And plus, it gets really convoluted, first principles, because often, even just like a defense against too much performance, when you generate HTML, often you're generating it off of a template, which there's a lot of performance wins there. That's just some string interpolation that's going to be going on there. And then when you're generating JSON, though, you're actually doing some sort of crawl across potentially a very complex object. And so it's like, to even remotely argue which one's more performance is just kind of like, I can't make that argument until you show me a server that I can measure doing something sufficiently complex. And then did they even set all those things up correct? But I do agree with the idealism often creates these situations which don't exist. And I mean, I fall into this kind of stuff too. But it is true to make those one-dimensional statements, forego all the possible other things that can be happening, and then even more so, just dump on the fact that, all that stuff could be slow, but your 120 millisecond round trip to a database, that's probably really where all your slowness is coming from. So your extra 0.5 milliseconds you're taking to crunch some HTML, if that even is real, meaningless. It's just meaningless in the end.
Right. And like, this is the same thing with like the edge stuff, right? Like, well, the edge is a lot faster, but if you got to go from the edge to the data store, like What
Yeah.
do we, like, let's see the empirical numbers here for like real world stuff. And I just, to get back to your original sort of question, like that's what I'd like to see from the software engineering people in academia, is just a more empirical and like ugly, like gronky stuff. Like, that's the one thing that I've always preferred systems to the more theoretical stuff. Like I used to, when I was at Stanford, for for grad school, I would always like pigeonhole the AI people and be like, "What have you actually accomplished?" Now, of course, like they can all come back and be like, "Well, I'll just cry into my giant pile of dollar bills, I guess." But back in the '90s or in the late early 2000s, like AI was kind of, it was, I don't want to say it was dead, but it was obviously nowhere near what it is now, and it had kind of gone through this. There's what was called the AI winter, where
Yeah.
there was a lot of like hope in the late '70s and early '80s, and then it kind of crashed. And
And it stayed
just
crashed for quite a bit of time.
it did, yeah, and to the point that like an idiot systems programmer like me could be like haranguing these poor AI people at social events after got a couple of beers in me. But I've just always liked that like more real world, like let's make it. It's, one reason like I like web programming is that there's that immediacy of like a user, a UI. Like I don't like pure backend programming. Like I like full stack programming, so I like doing domain modeling and hooking up all my logic. But at the end of the day, it's like it's very rewarding to like make a button do a thing, and
Yeah.
sort of have that like complete sense of ownership over a feature. Like I did that thing. I don't know. I'd say for software engineering type people, I think more real world studies are useful. And sort of trying to be more empirical rather than like, oh, if you use UML, you'll produce better software. Do we have any evidence for that? Like, I haven't seen it.
Yeah. I I doubt personally. I doubt. And I think it was Napoleon that said, plans never survive first contact, or it could have been someone from Russia. I cannot remember, but
Yeah,
uh, either way, like I mean, that really, if it never worked in history, it may not work now.
yeah,
That UML is a great way to start the design process of software. But
yeah.
I do kind of want to switch a little bit of gears because you said something really interesting in there, which is that you really gravitate towards the web world. You really like to see a button go. But if I were to read the classes, if I just took somebody that never has been on Twitter and seen the prolific shit posting that you do, and have no idea that you are the HTMX guy, the lone man crying in the wilderness, that the world is too complex. Uh,
Sure.
I think if I read out the courses you teach, databases, compilers, system programmings, and maybe software engineering, I don't think anybody in their right mind would say that you're probably likely the person that's going to create a library that's effectively counterculture to the current web world
Mm,
that is trying to reduce the complexity for like 90% of apps. I think that's a
yeah.
pretty fair statement. So how did you get to that point? And how do you really, even more so, how did that get birthed out of such like really deep technical stuff into such, I would almost call it such a simple environment comparatively?
Yeah, I feel like I don't know. I don't know about you, but I feel like I'm often not in control of things. Like things, there are things that I do, and like I think I had a really like a good flash of insight with Intercooler, the original version of HTMX. That like okay, like event request replace, like that core idea, and then using attributes, which I stole from Angular. That's where I saw it. I saw Angular using attributes, and so mixing those two things together. But I don't know what to say other than it worked for me. It worked for the startup I was working on at the time, which Intercooler.js was an integral part of Lead Dyno, and so I was working with it every day, and it just was a better setup. And I've always been a little allergic to complexity. Like I don't like it when people there's a tendency in especially when you get around smart people to use language and conceptual sophistication as like a weapon, as a social weapon. And if you go into I struggled with this when I was young. You go into some technical meeting and someone would say, "Oh, but what about the blitter?" And I'm like, "I don't know what a blitter is. Like, what's
Yeah.
blitter?" And then I have to sit there and be quiet and can't have an opinion on other stuff because I don't know what a blitter is. And I've always reacted very poorly to that dynamic, and I've always been willing to like keep saying like, well, no, you need to explain that to me. And I got more like that as I got old. Like I've told this story before, but I was at a company when I was at Guidewire, which was the company that went public. I was on the platform team. I was young, but I was on the platform team, and so these were a bunch of really smart hotshots. And we were in a design meeting for some feature, and I kept saying like, this is too complicated. And the lead developer, who was sort of my technical hero at the time, was like, your problem is you give up too early. And and I think it's just been, at the time I was pretty devastated, but as I've gotten older, I'm like, you know what? The problem was he didn't give up early enough. Like he kept going, he kept pushing complexity. Like, this has to be perfect. This has to be perfect. And then, I reread Worse is Better and started to just develop more of a philosophy, and was like, you know what? Like, I really prefer the simple model. I'm certainly willing to write pretty complicated code. Like HyperScript, for example, is a very complicated piece of code. But I do try to like always just have simplicity on my mind. So I don't know. I don't know. I don't know what to tell you. I feel like a lot of this stuff has fallen into my lap, and I got lucky. Like, you finding out about HTMX was lucky. Like intercooler. If I had never, so COVID, why does HTMX even exist? Because COVID hit, and I was trapped inside in California, and had to like not lose my mind. And so I just locked myself in a room for like a week and rewrote intercooler. Was that me? Like, no, that was just, outside events pushing me to do something. And so I don't know. I feel like I've been very, very, very lucky, more than, any like particular like mindset. I'm a contrarian, obviously, but that's not always good. That's been very painful for me in my life at times. So,
well, what was a moment that it was painful for you? If you can relate it to software. If it's just like being a contrarian with your wife, I get that. You don't want to be too contrarian in that area.
Yeah. Financially, like, I've lost a lot of money because I've looked at markets, for example, and been like, this is irrational, and not like kept money in markets. So I'd be a lot wealthier if I wasn't a contrarian. I interned at Google when I was in grad school, and I was a constant like joker and pain in the ass for my bosses, and like ended up getting like a do not hire mark. I'd be a lot wealthier if it'd be worse for me. I wouldn't know about recursive descent because I learned that at Guidewire, which is where I went instead. But just like, there's a lot of times, like, if I could go back to when I was younger, I'd definitely, one of the conversations I'd have with myself is like, pick your battles. It's okay to be a contrarian, but you need to pick your battles. Like, there's stuff that's not worth it. That's something I've gotten better at in the last few years.
A wise man once told me that there's a many a hill to die on. You just need to figure out which ones are worth it to die on.
Yeah, 100%.
And I really appreciated that, because I was always the person that was willing to get into any argument.
Yeah.
And then I realized, not everything needs to be like, I don't need to win every fight, because I'd rather lose 3 fights but still win the war, because you didn't build up all that. I find like whenever I work with someone who dies on every hill, I start not liking to work with that person, because I know that every single little thing, even like just simple stuff that should be like, it doesn't even matter. Just get it in, make it work, and I don't care. Like, that should be the answer to a lot of little problems, end up being these 2-day discussions. And then you end up having this kind of like allergy to working with them, because they lost or they won a bunch of little battles. And so when the big battle happens, like, hey, we want to switch up some major system, it's almost like when I hear them talk, I just discredit everything they say, because I'm like, oh, this guy's just arguing for the sake of arguing. He's not actually like trying to argue a good point of view. He's just arguing his point of view, which is very, which can often be different. That it's just like, oh, I believe this is right, therefore I argue all things. And so it's just something I kind of carried with me for a while.
That reminds me of I remember hearing about a study with the way rats play, like when they wrestle. If a big rat will actually let a little rat win wrestling matches
1/3 of the time.
Yeah, exactly. In order to keep the game going, and a lot of social activity is a game at some level. And so, if you want to keep playing the game, you need to give people a win every once in a while and be reasonable. Another thing that I've, sort of learned, I would say, in the last 10 years is that people have good points. Like there's if you listen to criticisms and just accept it and let someone have their way, like it'll probably be okay. Like, I can't tell you how many times, and this is maybe a negative situation, but I can't tell you how many times I've seen a tech company where they either push someone out or someone quits because it's just too frustrating. And I'm like, man, we're screwed now. Like this company is doomed without that person. And then the company somehow continues on and it continues working. And it's like all this stuff matters so much less than we think. And there's these bigger forces at work in our lives. If you're a spiritual person, which I am, like, you know, like there's just stuff that's pushing us in directions, and there's a war on for things that matter, that we don't see day to day. And so, you know, all I can say, you know, to the younger people, I guess, watching is, I think, you know, letting go of some stuff is really a good thing, and being okay with, you know, not necessarily getting your way, or the way I would maybe look at it is, again, is let other people win the game every once in a while.
Yeah. How does that translate into teaching your students, especially like say the software engineering class? How do you try to give them this wisdom? Because I will say that I do truly believe that modern web and kind of this side of the development field, I can't speak for, say, gaming or embedded or any other kind of field. We've like drank the Kool-Aid of complexity. It is most
Right.
certainly overtly complex for a lot of things that we build. How do you kind of bring maybe a more like weighted way into trying to teach, you know, the next gen who takes on the mantle of responsibility? How do you teach that? How do you give them that wisdom?
I think you know, some, if you really want to communicate well on the internet, memetics are really important. You know, being funny, like people remember funny stuff. It's not just, you know, being funny is no joking matter. Because you know, if you're just a
It's funny thing
stick
you
in the
just said
mud. If you're just a stick in the mud, you know, I was like, for a long, people like, oh, you know, you're such a marketing genius. I'm like, go back and look at Intercooler and how it did over time. Like, where's the marketing genius back then? I was more embittered and sarcastic back then, because I was like, oh, you people are so crazy, you know? And now I really try hard not to say too much negative stuff about React. Like, I'll do it every once in a while. I get provoked and I can't help myself. But, you
My
know, I
favorite
think,
one, of course, was yesterday. Sorry, I have to interrupt. You got provoked and someone said something about loading times. And so then you just put up the throbber that just kept
right.
loading forever and be like, here's your
Yeah.
framework on a 3G
Yeah, I
connection.
know. I know. That was maybe, it is like, I'm actually going to give a talk about that at Big Sky DevCon, and talk about, like, you know, trying to be effective on Twitter and online discourse. You know, I think you just have to, with the kids, so a couple things I do with my kids is, number one, I want them to code a lot. Like that's one thing that they don't get in
Yeah.
CS often. Like they're not coding a lot. And so I really
Yeah.
try to make my classes code heavy, like write code, because the only way to get good at writing code is writing code. Like, you know, you have to do it. And so most of us do it when we work after school. And then I do try to keep pounding into them, like, it's okay to not, you know, one thing that I think is really important for a lot of people in computer science is to be okay with not understanding. Like, keep coming back to it. Like, just be okay with, like, I don't get it, but okay, I'm going to write the code. You know, I think learning how to use a debugger is really important, because it gives you a mental model for how the code's working. Not necessarily for like troubleshooting, but just from a learning perspective. I think the debugger is really important. So that's one thing that I show my students how to use and really emphasize is you need to know how to debug. If you're going to come to my office hours and ask me a question, I want you to have a breakpoint set at the part that you're confused about. And like, let's get to that breakpoint and look at the state of the system and understand what the system is going to do from there. And, you know, I mean, I give people my Grug Brain essay, you know, and try and, like, humor is very good. It's something that's sort of universal with humans, and I think de-escalates the situation for students. So I think there's sort of that dual prong of, like, hey, try not to be like super clever, and then, hey, it's okay if you don't get this stuff. And, like, here are the tools to help you, and here's the mental model to develop to become an effective developer. So, you know, I don't know, that's kind of my approach to teaching.
I like that. I like that a lot. That was really good. Thank you for doing this. I really appreciate you coming on. I absolutely love just the direction generally of HTMX. HTMX obviously opened me up to the whole world of these type of ways web development apps are developed. I know that like DHH has Hotwire, right? Phoenix
Yeah.
Live View, I think, is another version of this that's slightly more complex, adds more features, but still kind of
Yeah.
similar experience. Elixir mentioned potentially, which is also a Brazil mentioned right there. I also I must say that the way you use Twitter is fantastic. I'm very happy. I truly do think. I know you say that you say a lot of your success comes because there just happen to be a bunch of people that are loud and have a lot of followers all say something about you at the same time, which was Fireship.
Yep.
Me, I think TJ was talking a lot about it. TJ
Yep.
technically was the one that told me about HTMX.
Yeah.
So TJ is the real hero
TJ.
here again.
Absolutely.
Uh, but I would say that a lot of times anyone who gets recommended, anything that gets put onto a spotlight, anything like that, that's just opening the door.
Yeah.
People still have to walk through. It's still
Yeah.
what HTMX is and how you communicate that really made the W.
Right.
Because you could have easily fizzled out like every other thousands of projects that we have seen that come and go. Like, I mean, even thinking about Bun, how much artificial astroturfing brought up it has, and I feel like Bun is less relevant than HTMX. Like, I hear way more about one than the other. I'm much more willing to use one than the other. It's very interesting how that works out.
Yeah, I like the Bun guys. So
I do too.
but,
I like them. They're
but,
very, very smart.
Yeah, smart guys. It's a right place, right time, and so that's one of the things I'm going to mention in my talk is like, if luck is a big deal and if like a right place at the right time is a big deal, then one of the most important things is to just stick around. Like Intercooler stuck around for a day, and then HTMX like was just Intercooler 2.0, and so the best way to stick around is to make it fun. Like if you're just sitting there all day, like screaming, like, oh, you're doing it wrong. Like you people, like, this is stupid. You're not, you can't negativity. And I may not seem like it now, but I am prone to like pretty negative, being a negative person at times. And that negativity I've just learned over time, it's like not useful. It's just not, it really isn't useful. Every once in a while, a good sarcastic tweet will like go viral, and that's kind of bad. Like it's the nature of social media. But
it's also the juxtaposition of who you are. Like everyone has this like version of who you are, and so you're usually a pretty lighthearted person. So when you do that kind of thing, it's like this. It's the law of disproportions. It's comedy in of itself for you to be negative.
Yeah, that contrast is exactly. But you can't live there. That's what I've learned.
Yeah.
Because I've tried living there in that negative, sarcastic world, and it was not good for me, and it was not good for achieving anything. So I consider myself lucky, but I do think if you can maximize your chance of getting lucky by sticking with an idea for a long time, if it's a good idea. Like that's been my experience. It's survival bias too. Like, it's a science of single instances and so forth. So I don't know what to say about that, but that's been my experience.
Yeah. Well, my experience is somewhat similar. I obviously did streaming for a long, long time before any of this took off. I did 2+ years of 30 people or less watching me, 6 people, right? And now things have definitely changed in the last couple years. And I largely attribute it to the fact that I don't regularly get angry. I'm not an upset person. I'm just excited about what I'm doing. And when you're excited, other people are excited. In fact, one of the reasons why I will watch stuff on YouTube that's completely irrelevant to me is because I watch somebody that's excited. And I'm like, oh, this person's excited. Like I'm excited because they're excited. Like I get pumped up when I see excitement and I want to be a part of it.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. And, I have to say, like, I've learned some of that from you as well. Like, I every once in a while I'll check in on Twitter and what you get in response to your tweets and just like some of the crazy stuff that people say. And I'm like, he just didn't respond to it. Like, perfect.
I largely don't respond, or I will respond with, he's probably correct. My favorite one is when someone's really unhinged. You get, I forget who, Falcon or whatever the Marvel superhero is, which he goes, this guy's out of line, but he's correct, right? Like, I love hitting him with that one because what's the person supposed to do after that? Be like, and fuck you, Yeah.
Right, where do
You're
you
like,
go?
where do you
Yeah.
go with that one?
Where do you go with it? Yeah, I've got like, and and this is another thing I'm going to talk about at Big Sky DevCon. Drawing energy from your critics. Like, so this is just, I'm going to give you another little funny personal story, but like 2 or 3 weeks ago, I had just come back from a youth baseball tournament, and I had made a pretty egregious coaching error. Like I had screwed up on pitch count, which is like, that's the one thing the head coach needs to be on top of. This is pitch count. So I pulled one of our best pitchers early, and I was just crushed because we lost the game, and we would have had a better shot if we had, like, whatever. So I was like in a really bad spot, and I was like freaking out about Big Sky DevCon and like trying to get HTMX 2.0. I was just in a bad spot. And so I'm on Twitter, and this guy who just literally hates me and HTMX, he responds to a tweet and is like, he says one of the meanest things anyone has ever said to me. I'm not going to say what he said, but it was just like truly mean spirited. And I'm in bed like an idiot reading my phone, and like already like just like grinding, so bad. And I read this tweet, and it just absolutely went through me like a knife, like, just in bed, just like, this is awful. But then I hit that bottom, and I could feel it, and I just started laughing. I'm like, this is so funny. Like, it's youth baseball, Carson. Who cares? Like, and like this dude online is like, who cares? Like, it's all
Yeah.
good. And like I bounced back from that. And so that experience of of there's just in the negativity, there's so much negativity out there, and you can take it and turn it into something positive. And that's better for everyone. It's better for the negative person, it's better for you, it's better for everyone who's watching. So it's surprising to me that I'm such an advocate of positivity given my personality for the first 35 years of my life, but here we are.
Here we are. All right, we're gonna end this here. The conversation is gonna continue for a little bit in Discord, so I'm gonna have you stick around, Carson. I'm gonna end the stream. It'll be in the top shelf in the Discord. Tier 2s and Tier 3s going to be a part of it, and we're just going to kind of do a little bit more of a Q&A for maybe 10 or 15 more minutes. Do you have the time for that? Because we kind of got started a little bit late.
If I can make the audio work.
Well, what I was thinking about doing is I will just have you stay as you are, and I'll just pipe all the audio through, and I'll just make it work on my end.
Okay.
So I will stream my audio into Discord.
Sounds good.
All right. Yeah. So hold on just one moment. We're going to end the stream now. Hey, thanks everybody for joining us. This is pretty awesome. Thank you. Bye.